Hi everyone, my name is Raneesh. I'm from Calcey Technologies. Thank you for joining this edition of the React Native Meetup. Today we'll actually be talking about forms, or at least how to build forms the React way. Just a small note before we begin. If you have any questions, there's a link pinned in the comment section where you can ask all your questions, and our team will actually get back to you as soon as possible. Forms. What are forms fundamentally? So, they are an explicit way to transfer information between two parties. We fill out forms all the time in our day to day life. So, web forms, on the other hand, take this to the next level. Web forms allow us to gather information from an entire audience of people that visit our websites. But when this is all said and done, sometimes incentivizing users to fill out a form is a pretty tough gig. And it becomes even more challenging when the form is badly built and inefficient at its core. So I'm sure most of you have built at least a single HTML form when you were starting out, and it might have looked something like this. So as you can see, this is just a very simple, almost too simple login form with a few simple input elements, for a username, a password, and a generic submit button. I think most of you would have, described the experience of building something like this as just fine, nothing special. Maybe some of you might even have found the experience downright boring. Of course, as simple as this looks, the hard part comes when you start to scale up and the form gets more and more complicated. But before we get far-fetched, let's see if React can somewhat alleviate the boring aspects in at least the fundamental steps of building forms. So you might be asking yourself, just how much can React actually improve on the form building process? I mean, it can't be that much different from plain old vanilla JS, considering that React is a JavaScript library, right? And you're right, it's not an entirely new or original take on writing forms, but React does offer some pretty neat ways to help us make writing and handling forms a little bit easier and, dare I say, a bit more interesting. So, how exactly are forms different in React? So, it all comes down to state, or in other words, how the data from the actual form is stored and handled. So typically in HTML, form elements maintain their own state and update it each time the user updates the input. But in React, these form inputs actually can be maintained in the component state itself, which is basically the state maintained by the React component that the form lives in. So instead of each form element maintaining their own state, the component itself maintains a single source of truth or a single point of control, in other words, over the entire form. So a form element that is handled in this way is called a controlled component. So this basically means your data, or in other words, your state, and your UI, or in other words, your form elements, are always in sync. So the state gives the value to the form field through a prop, and the field asks the component state to change the current value. So this way you can basically share the form state even with another UI component, or even manipulate a certain form element state from a totally different event handler. And also from a development standpoint, the entire form becomes more accessible and easier to control. So now let's take a quick look at a very simple example of how controlled components work. So here we have a very a very simple form. We have the form tags, we have one input, and we have just a generic submit button. So I've also just used the class component here to make it easier to visualize the form state structure. So what actually makes this form have controlled elements? So this value prop here, so this is what does it all. So we control the value that is input and displayed in the input field, and we ask the component to store the input value in its state through this onChange handler that we have written here. So what happens in the actual on-change handler? It sets the state of the appropriate field element, as you can see here, where it is declared. So this way, the data and your UI is always in sync. So now we come to the alternative way to handle a form, known as uncontrolled components. So uncontrolled components are form elements whose data is maintained in the DOM itself. So similar to how it's done by default in HTML. The DOM is always in control of the form state. So whenever form data is needed, it can be queried from the required form element by using something called a ref. So what is a ref? A ref is basically a simple function provided by React, which we can use to access a node on the DOM. That is a React element that has been rendered to the DOM. So you might be asking at this point, why we would ever use uncontrolled components, if it's basically the same as handling a regular form in HTML. The thing is, uncontrolled components allow us to integrate React code with non-React code. And they can also be written very quickly with a very minimal amount of code. So fundamentally, there's no taboo with using uncontrolled components. It's just that control components, are the standard convention for React forms, and it makes your code much cleaner and more readable. So if a scenario, ever comes up where using control components would not work, or it would be too much of an overhead, feel free to use uncontrolled components to actually get the job done. So, the same way we did before, let's take a quick look at another simple example of how uncontrolled components work. So, same as before, we actually have a form tag, and a simple input and a generic submit button. But if you can see here, the form state is not actually controlled by the component, because if you can see here, we actually don't have the value prop that we used before, or the on-change handler either. So form state is handled completely by the DOM. All we have here is actually this ref prop, to which we pass a React ref function so that we can fetch the input values from the DOM whenever we need. If you can probably see here, we actually have quite a significant lower number of lines when we use uncontrolled components. And you can basically use this format if you have, if you need to create like a very quick, simple form, which you need to get done immediately. But the normal React convention again is to use controlled components. So we can actually just look at these two controlled and uncontrolled component forms like this. So as I mentioned, just a single input, single submit button works exactly the same way. So let's just enter something here, maybe my name, submit it, and simply there you get the output. The same way, just enter the name here, submit it, exactly the same process, exactly the same output. So moving on. So up to now, everything should seem relatively straightforward and easy to follow. But we've still only actually implemented one or two form fields of the same type with no validation or error feedback. So you might be asking ourselves, what makes an okay or a good form great? So let's look at it from a user's perspective. So input validation. Forms transfer information from your users or your audience to us. So if that data is not in a very usable format, it actually adds no value to us, right? So input validation is really important in that aspect. And when it comes to displaying error feedback, users always have to be informed when there is something wrong or when they are doing something wrong. Otherwise, it's just bad user experience. They'll keep trying to submit the form and nothing happens. And they will likely get frustrated and basically leave. And multiple types of input. So you have to always know the correct input type to use for a specific type of data. For instance, if you take a very simple and intuitive example, a text field can't be used to enter your bio data, right? You have to use a text area instead because it requires more space, and so on. So, how about from a developer's perspective? So, how do we make a good form great? So, mainly we have reusability. So, how do we benefit from reusability? Form elements start to become more scalable. When you start writing reusable components, your components are more organized and centralized. So basically, the bigger the app gets, the easier it is to develop. And readability. Your code obviously becomes easily navigable and understandable. So think of an instance basically when a new developer joins the team. The code base obviously won't be cluttered with redundant elements and logic. And all of this combined will obviously save time because you're reusing instead of rewriting. So now let's look at a form that more or less has these functionalities that we discussed. All right. So first of all, this is the simple form that we will actually be talking about. It's quite simple. It has a few new input types. It has a name, email, select list to select a hobby, and just a basic radio code. So if you look at the code, the structure of the form actually is not much different because we'll be using control components from here on out. So let's start with the state declaration. So as I mentioned earlier, I have actually used a class component here so that you can visualize the state a bit better. So if you can see here, we actually have a slice of state dedicated for the form controls. So if you can see here, as I mentioned, we have the name field, we have a state slice for the email, for the hobby, and the student status radio group. So you might think, it's a bit more complex than the last state declaration that we saw, but it'll get easier once we go through this a bit. So basically we have a property to hold the value of the input field, and then we have a property called touched. So this basically denotes if the input field has been touched or not, because validating a field that the user has not even interacted with is wrong. So this is how we keep track of that. And then we have a property to assign an error. So it denotes if the input field is valid or not, and it will contain the error message if it is invalid. And we also finally have a list of validation rules that we require that this input field go through so that we know that the user's input is valid. So for example, for the name, I have actually given a minimum length of 3 characters, and I have also mentioned that the name, entering the name is mandatory, is required. So on and so forth, I have actually done sort of the same thing for the other field elements. And then when we get to the actual form, it's pretty much the same process. You have the form tags, and between the form tags, you have the field elements. So, but in this case, I have actually built some reusable components. So if you actually, visit one component, for example, the input component, you can see that we just have a very simple input tag along with, an input label, and then a small span so that we can display an error message. So we also do some small validations to display some kind of error feedback if the user somehow starts, fills out the form with an error. So the writing a reusable component like this is not tough. As you can see, it's a very simple component and it gets the job done. So we have 2 input fields for the name and email, and then we have a select list and the radio group. So pretty much the same process again when writing these reusable components. So what actually happens when the user interacts with the form? So let's see. First, we actually, from the change event, we actually capture the name of the field as well as the value that the user has entered. And we also just take a copy of the current state of the component that we hold. And then from that state, we actually take a copy of the slice of that specific field element that we are interacting with. So what we do here is we just set the value that the user has entered, and then we assign this touch property as true because the user has indeed interacted with this field element. And we also run a small validation function to assign the error, if any. And then all we do is we simply save all this data to our form field slice. And we do one more thing. So we also iterate through the form's state slices and update the overall form validity. So how do we do this? We just iterate through the different form controls of the form fields, and we check if there is no error and also if the field is touched. So in this case, if all the field elements actually obey this rule, then the overall form is valid. So I have actually used this validation for the submit button. So the submit button will not enable until the form is valid. So let's take a look at the actual form. So let's take a look at some of the validation errors that we get. So imagine if I enter a name which is less than 3 characters. So as you can see here, we actually have an error popping up. So before we move on further, how does this error pop up? So if you remember, we actually have a small validation function written. It's very simple. What we do is we just iterate through. If you can remember, we actually have this object of the validation rules that each form field must follow. So what we do is we actually iterate through those validation rules, and we do a few small validations. If any of those validations fail, what we do is we return the error message. So we have the same rules, the same logic for the is required validation, the minimum length validation, and also small validation to check if the user has entered a valid email. So let's move on. So let's type a proper name, maybe my name, and then let's actually use a proper email. Let's try to break it a little bit. All right. So you can see that the validation actually does work. So it informs us that the email address is invalid. It also gives us a small red border on the input field to exaggerate this effect. So now that's done, we can actually select a hobby, and we can actually select something from the radio group. And as you can see, now that the form is actually valid, the submit button got enabled, and you can see the output here. All right, so let's move on ahead. Okay, so now that we've actually seen what we can do with React, let's see what else is out there, to help make our lives a little easier. So there's basically no use reinventing the wheel, right? And doing everything ourselves if people have done a lot of the work for us already. So I've just taken the liberty of listing down some of the most popular form libraries for React. So let's just take a quick look at the pros and cons of each of them, and I'll tell you which one we are moving forward with. So first of all, Redux Form. This is actually one of the most famous libraries when it comes to form building, and it has been around for a long time now. As the name suggests, Redux Form uses Redux to handle form state. And the good part about this is that you can basically access your form state from anywhere in your app, as it's available in the global store. If you know a little bit about Redux, you'll know this. But here comes the bad part. As Dan Abramov, the creator of Redux, once said, use React for ephemeral state and use Redux for global state. So what is this ephemeral state? So ephemeral state is state that has a very short lifespan, and in 99% of cases, form state falls into this category. Because filling out a form is supposed to be a short process, or a short-lived process rather, and we don't need to maintain that state after the user has submitted the form. So storing form state in the Redux global store turns out to be an unnecessary overhead. Not to mention that Redux Form is tightly coupled with Redux, and can only be used with an app that already uses Redux for state management. So considering all this, Redux Form clearly doesn't suit our needs here. So let's move on. I'll quickly explain about the next two, the React Hook Form and Formic libraries together, because they are quite similar. To start off, when it comes to implementation, both libraries are extremely similar and have almost the same learning curve. If you've used one, you can use the other with a very short learning curve with no problem. And in addition, both libraries have no integration to any external state management tool like Redux. And both libraries also have a relatively small bundle size compared to the other alternatives out there. And apart from those, React Hook Form does have an edge when it comes to performance, as it isolates form state to a per field level instead of at the entire forms level. So what happens here is that it actually results in a less number of re-renders, due to state changes. But despite this, I will actually be moving forward with Formic for the rest of today's session. So let me tell you why. As a beginner or an entry-level developer into React, or at least to building efficient forms in React, Formic is the best way to go in my opinion, because it has been around for a longer time, and majority of the React developer community globally use and highly endorse Formic. So even if you run into a problem or an issue, you can get it easily resolved through a quick Google search. The other thing is that Formic can be used to build forms using both class components as well as functional components. So, it's true that functional is the future, when it comes to React. But then again, it's always great to have that flexibility as an up and coming developer at this time. So the final thing is that when it comes to Formic, it's extremely easy to integrate, third-party UI components with your form fields. It's practically plug and play, and you'll see it in action in a short while. In the case of React Hook Form, you'll have to actually use a wrapper component called a controller to wrap your third-party components to make them more functional. So all this being said, let's actually move on to figure out what Formic actually is. So, what is Formic? First off, it's a lightweight and declarative library for building React forms. Declarative being the key word here. Formic actually basically takes care of the most repetitive and annoying parts of building a form and leaves us, the developer, to literally build the actual form. Formic takes care of setting up the state and the change handlers and persisting input values as well. And it even takes care of keeping track of errors and visited fields, and also exposes a very easy way to take care of form validation, which we will dive into soon. So because of this, Formic is also super intuitive and very easy to adopt into your React apps. There's way less code, and it just uses plain old React state and props under the hood. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, Formic does not use any external state management tool by default. So because of this, Formic can be integrated incrementally into your application at any pace you require. And in the same way, it's also very easy to get rid of should you ever need to, because it's not very tightly coupled with your business logic. So, if you're still asking, what's in it for me? Why should I even consider Formic? This is the answer in a nutshell, because you don't have to worry about handling form state or keeping track of your data. This means that you'll be dealing with a very minimal amount of code, which in turn saves a lot of time when you have to meet deadlines. And it's extremely easy to learn, and the development experience is very intuitive, as I mentioned earlier. Obviously, again, if most of the hard part happens under the hood, it's going to be very easy to maintain, refactor, and test as well. So even a new developer who joins your team can catch up in no time at all. And like I mentioned, Formic has an absolutely massive community of developers online that you can turn to get the best solution for whatever problem you run into. And most importantly, there's no need for tiers. Of course, this doesn't take into account all the tiers that comes from last minute requirement changes or from your clients. But then again, it's out there. So let's take a quick look at the same form that we built before, but this time, written using Formic. All right. So here we actually have the same form that we built before, but in Formic. As you can see, it's literally the same. So, but you can very quickly see, compared to the last form's component, we even had a validation function here. This component seems to be actually pretty simple, and straightforward. So why is this? Because as I mentioned before, when you use Formic, you actually have no state declaration, because all of that happens under the hood with Formic. And then you also don't have any on-change handlers, and even the submit handler calls prevent default for you, the prevent default function. So you don't have to write all that from scratch. So it actually takes away a lot of the pain, when writing, developing a form, and you don't have to think about it as much. You can just dive into developing the form very easily. So, when it comes to forming, so we actually have the Formic tag here, which encompasses the entire form. You can basically pass in the initial values of your form. So, for example, we have, as before, the name field, the email field, the hobby select list, as well as the student status radio group. So, as you can see here, obviously, since all of those fields contain strings, we actually have given a whole bunch of strings as our initial values. And Formic also allows us to directly pass in our validations to the validate prop, where it proceeds to automatically validate the fields as you interact with them. So this way we don't have to explicitly tell the form to validate our fields. So that is also, a big step forward, as it makes your whole development experience more simpler. So if you look at the actual form, you can actually see that we only have a whole bunch of these field tags. So what is this field tag? It's actually a component that's provided to us by Formic. So as you can see, the input fields are all wrapped by this field tag. And if you remember before, we actually had to pass all the form attributes like value, on change, the errors and so on to each of our form field elements. So if you can see here, this is in the earlier form. So now all we have to do is actually pass in the name of the field and maybe the type as well as the component. So this component prop is where we actually assign our reusable component that we use with a form. So this is because actually under the hood, Formic actually utilizes the React context API, and once you wrap your form with the Formic tag, all the Formic components you use inside that tag immediately becomes consumers of that Formic state. So if you actually look at one of these components, you can see that even though we didn't pass any of those specific props that I mentioned before, the on-change prop, the value prop, and so on, it's all contained within the attributes that Formic provides us with. So all you have to do is just spread out and pass in all the props that Formic gives us. And I have also actually passed in a label prop as well, because I'll be displaying the input label in this reusable component as well. And another thing is that Formic actually provides us with this error message component. So you don't actually have to, pass in a string or, a specific style or anything. So the error message component handles it for you. All you need to do is give it the name of the field that the error needs to be assigned to. So moving on, when you look at the rest of the fields as well, for the select field and the radio field, there is also one other additional prop to which I have actually passed in the bunch of options that we need to display in the list. So it's just very simply an array of objects with the options that we have passed. So let's again just take a look at the form. We can just go through it again. Let's look at the same errors that we encountered before. If we actually enter less than 3 characters, you get the same error. If we actually enter an invalid email, you get the its email address is invalid, and so on. So let's actually fill out this form properly as we did before, and then submit it. So yeah, so as you can see, Formic really does simplify the form building process by a huge amount, and even this validation function, it's simpler than before, because you don't have to iterate through all the different validation rules. All you need to do is just put up a bunch of if conditions and validate your fields. And if the validation fails, all you need to do is return an object with your specific fields that contain the errors. So pretty simple so far. So let's move on. So there's one other aspect that I thought I'd take a moment to talk about, which are some of the most popular hooks that come with Formic. So yes, Formic does come with a whole bunch of hooks. The first one is called use field. So use field can actually be used whenever we want to build our own custom inputs or more advanced inputs that we have tighter control over. So if you see the given example, this hook is actually one of the ways we can integrate form elements from third-party UI libraries, such as Material UI, React Strap, and Design, you name it. So this is the syntax of how this hook is declared, and I'll show you, a brief example on how to exactly use it pretty soon. The next most popular hook is called use Formic context, and this hook is actually mostly used to add more advanced behaviors and functionalities to a form. So you can get a small idea, from the given example, where you can actually use this hook to implement a small component that automatically maybe submits your form once a required input has been entered. You can also use it to maybe dynamically render a form element based on previously input data. Of course, these are some of the the use cases off the top of my head, and the actual use cases will probably vary depending on your specific requirements and use cases. So one thing that you have to keep in mind is that to use this hook, you need to actually have the Formic component somewhere high up on your component tree. That means basically your form has to be wrapped by the Formic component so that it can access the Formic context. So with this in mind, you can be creative with it as you want, within the proper context. There's also one other hook that I should probably tell you about, called use Formic. Not use Formic context, just use Formic. It basically has the same functionality as use Formic context, except for the fact that you should only use it if you aren't using the Formic component already. As I mentioned earlier, for use Formic context, you need to have the Formic component higher up in the component tree. In this case, you don't. Why? Because use Formic does not render a React context provider. So because of this, you actually can't use the field component that we used before, or the error message component, and so on, that we actually been using, as they all consume React context. So for this reason, this hook isn't as widely used, and you probably won't run into it very often. So now that we have actually covered basically everything we need to build a top-notch form in React, let's go through a form which we might build for a real-world scenario. You'll also get to see how I use some of these hooks in this form. So let's do it. All right. So this is the form that we will be looking at. It sort of mimics a real-world scenario. It's a supervisor evaluation form. So the sort of which you'd use, if you're an undergraduate who has to review your project, supervisor maybe. And as you can see, it has multiple sections, with multiple types of input that are obviously most suitable for the respective type of data that is being collected. So, we have, just to start off, we have text fields, we have select lists, we have sliders, which is a new one. We have radio groups, we have text areas, and so on. And also, we have something special. So in the module review section that you can see here, we actually use something called a field array. That is something that Formic provides us with to make our lives a whole lot easier. So we'll also see how that's used when we look at the code. So let's do it. So as you can see, the structure of the actual code is pretty similar to it's not that different to the last Formic form that we looked at, except it's a bit more complex. So part of the reason is that I have actually used Material UI to give the form sort of a more professional look. And something else that adds to the site complexity is that I have implemented a small dialog or modal, to display the Formic values object after you have submitted the form. So while we just walk through this code, you can just ignore all these use state functions in the top and all of that code. So let's start with Formic. So if you can see here, we actually, first of all, so I have actually declared the initial values up top here. So you can just go through that. We have, as you saw before, the first name, last name, student ID, email, supervisor, and so on. But we have something new here. We have something called validation schema, which is a prop that Formic has. So this is actually another way we can set up form validation. So if we actually go into this schema, so what is it? So there's this validation library called yup, where we can actually build a schema that mimics the shape of our form. And we can validate, our fields using these pre-written validation methods. So as you can see here, we actually declare something called a shape, and we pass an object into it that mimics the shape of our form. So we have the first name, the last name, student ID, email, supervisor, and the module feedback section. And the great thing about yup is that it actually provides us with all the typical validations that we generally tend to use with forms, pre-written and exposed as chainable methods. So basically, validating your form becomes a whole lot easier because you don't have to keep thinking about edge cases that you might have missed and so on. So of course, there are even though I use yup here, there are other schema builders and validation libraries like JOI, validator, and so on. But this is a whole other topic that we can probably go into detail in another session. So in the future. So for now, just know that validation schemas exist, and it makes our life much easier when it comes to form validation. All right. So let's go back here. So as you can see here, we actually have 3 different form sections. So we have the student information section, the overall evaluation, and also the module review section. All right. So let's just look into these sections one by one. So if we talk about the student information section, all right. So in the student information section, we have the first name, the last name, the student ID, and the email. So as I mentioned before when we were talking about the hooks, there are a few ways to implement a custom UI component with Formic. So in this case, in this first case for the first name, we have actually directly used the text field component that is provided to us from Material UI for one of our text input fields. So as you can see, it's pretty simple. We directly use the third-party component, and we get the required props from Formic, such as the value on change, on blur, the errors, and the touch property that we used before, and we just pass them all in. But I think it should get pretty obvious, pretty soon that this is not a very scalable method, as you have to keep passing in, a whole load of props every time you need to implement a new field. So then we come to, the second and third ways, where we basically write a reusable component of our own. So in these two ways, the only difference is that in the first way, we actually use the field component, as we did before, that is provided to us by Formic, which passes all the props into this reusable component. And the second way is actually we directly use our own reusable component in the form itself. So how do we do this? Let's just take a quick look. That's right. So how we use it is actually we declare the used field hook that we talked about before. So instead of us actually, having to use this field component, we can actually capture all the form attributes that Formic provides us with directly from our own reusable component. So as you can see here, we actually get all the field props through this property, and the meta property actually gives us the touch property and the error states as well. And from here on out, very simple component. As you can see, we don't even need to, of course, when we use Material UI or another such UI component library, we actually don't need to even use custom custom tags to display labels or error messages even. So all we need to do is spread out and pass the props that we get from the use field hook, and also any other props that we pass in of our own. So for example, I pass in this label props for each of these form fields. So I actually access that separately and I pass that in as well. So now that you've seen this, I actually want to refactor this first name field as well for it to be a bit more scalable, and we'll see exactly how much of the code that we actually get rid of by doing it this way. So let's just take a copy of this field. Let's just put this here, rename this to first name, this first name as well, and that's literally it. So now that we actually don't need all these props, we can completely get rid of them and then go back to our our container, our main container, and get rid of literally all these props. All right, so that itself makes it much more cleaner, and also we can also get rid of all these props that we request from Formic. All right, so let's move on to the next section, our overall evaluation section. So when we look at this section, we can see that it's pretty much similar to the all right, so you can see that it's pretty much similar to the student information section, and the only different thing is that we actually use some new fields. We have a supervisor select list, we have a slider, we have the Formic radio group, and also a text area for the overall suggestions or general suggestions. So this is still the same as before. It's just look into one of these components. It only spans a few lines. It's pretty simple. All we have to do is access the props that Formic provides us with, get the error and then maybe the error text, and simply pass all this information into our third-party component library, third-party components. Since the Material UI select component actually does not display its own error, we can actually, for this reason alone, Material UI actually provides us with these special components so that we can display our errors, and it's not that much difficult or complicated. All you need to do is pass in the required props that you get from Formic. All right. So now let's check out, the interesting part. Let's go to the module review section. So here I mentioned a keyword, field array. So what is a field array? So basically, the field array is exactly what it looks like. You can probably tell by now, it's an array of fields. So to be specific, we use field arrays when we want to implement a group of form sections that contain the same form fields. So as you can see here, it's basically like a repeating section. So we have a section for the final year project lectures, to review those specific lectures, and for the feedback sessions, and also any other feedback as well. So as you can see here, we have the same slider and the same text area in all these sections. So what field arrays allow us to do is, instead of actually repeating and implementing these form sections again and again, we can actually declare it first of all in our initial values. So if we actually go back and look at our initial values, this module feedback is the slice of state where we actually control this field array. So let's see what we actually give the initial values here. So if you can see this, it's simply an array of objects again, where each object represents one of the fields in our form section. So, we have the field for the final year project, for the feedback, and any other section. So, when we actually, look at the, So when we actually look at the field array, we can actually see what we do here. So what we do here, first of all, is, you might have probably guessed it, we iterate through this module feedback slice of state and implement this form section once only. So before that, how do we even get access to this slice of state? So this is where we actually use the other hook that I was talking about earlier. So the use Formic context hook. So as I mentioned, use Formic context can actually capture whatever form attributes and props that Formic provides us with if the Formic component is declared higher up in the component tree. So since it actually is, since we wrap the entire form with the Formic component, we can actually get access to all the values first of all. And then from those values, I can actually access the module feedback's slice of state directly. So when it comes to the field array, what we do is we declare the field array, and we iterate through the initial values that we provide, and we actually identify each form section uniquely with an index, and then we actually have, if you can remember, we have a title, the slider, and the text area. We also have this close button. So what exactly happens here? So if you say you don't need to actually review this specific section, you can simply, with a click of a button, get rid of it. So you can actually add these small but important features and functionalities that make a user's user experience better in this way. So how did we actually accomplish that? So we actually have a small button, and then we have a small callback function that actually removes this module. So very simply, it's almost super intuitive. So what we just do is we iterate through this module feedback slice of state, which is an array first and foremost, and we filter out any of the form sections whose index does not match our the index of the form section that we are closing, that we want to close. So once we have this new array of form sections, of the updated form sections, what we do is we use this function that is provided to us from Formic. So set field value. Set field value is a function that is provided to us by Formic in case we actually ever want to implement our own on-change handlers. So what set field value does is that it accepts the name of a field and the value. So what we do here is actually we use the name of the field, which is module feedback, and then we just pass in the updated module feedback array. So that's how the closing works. So let's actually just let's take a look at the form. So the other sections are pretty much simple. We have the slider component that we used previously, and also just a text area. So let's go back. Let's reset the form and let's go through each of these form fields. So again, we have the same error that we used before. The name has to have at least 3 or more characters. So let's give a proper name just for now, and also the same goes for the last name, and also the email has the exact same validation. So when it comes to student ID, so there is a specific validation that I have used here, so that the student ID has to be in a specific format. So if we just start entering a random bunch of numbers, obviously it will give us an error saying your student ID has to be in the format, this format. So these are some of the very quick validations that you can do when you use validation schemas, which of course, as I mentioned, we will discuss in the future in perhaps another session. So for now, let's just put in a value that goes together with the validation, and of course there a message when it goes away. And we can also select a supervisor. We can assign any rating you want. We can assign select your meeting preference, give a general suggestion, anything. Let's say just put a sample string there, and say that you actually have never gone for a feedback session with a supervisor, which is highly unlikely, but just for this scenario, let's just say you haven't. So you don't actually need to review that section, right? So we can simply just get rid of it. And then you can, it's very intuitive. It's just a form which you probably might have filled before, something like this. So just give some sample strings, give some sample ratings, and then you can simply go ahead and submit the form. So as you can see here, I mentioned that I had actually used a medal so that you guys can actually see the clear the state structure that Formic utilizes. So it's very similar to the initial values that we actually provide. And you can see that the information that we submitted with the form are clearly displayed here. All right, so that was a bit of a long section. And I've also just attached a small reset button. We can reset the form that way. Pretty simple stuff. So yeah, so let's go back. All right, to summarize what we've covered during this session, we've actually seen how React has actually elevated building forms with controlled and uncontrolled components. That's the first thing we looked at. We've seen how we can offer our users the best user experience possible, with validation, error messages, multiple types of input to collect data in the most effective way possible. And we've also seen that we don't actually need to reinvent the wheel, and that there are a whole bunch of already available libraries and resources out there to help us build forms faster and more efficiently. We went through the features and pros and cons of some of them, namely Redux Form, React Hook Form, and Formic. And then we've actually gone ahead with Formic, and we've discussed how to integrate Formic and utilize it in such a way that gives us the best possible development experience. Then we briefly touched base on Formic hooks and how they can be useful for certain use cases and context for additional behaviors. And finally, we just walked through a bit of a complex form, complex, but with a simple learning curve, with a very easy learning curve that we would likely build in a real world scenario. So you can actually get to building it very easily with Formic. So you might be asking, what's next? What's next when it comes to building efficient and highly scalable forms in React? Because as of now, in this session, we have actually barely scratched the surface of the power of React Forms and Formic even. So where we can look into how we can build and integrate a validation schema, to make our lives easier when it comes to validating highly dynamic forms. If you remember, we had actually used the validation schema in our final form that we looked at. That's how we easily, were able to implement those complex validations, such as this validation for the student ID and validations for the field arrays and so on. So we can get into a bit more detail about that perhaps in a future session. We can also check out how to augment our validation process by writing custom validations in a validation schema. Yes, so that's something that we didn't look into. We actually can look into that going forward. There are lots of different libraries that help you build validation schemas, and even without validation schemas, there are very powerful libraries that help you validate forms. So JOI, Validator, those are a few off the top of my head. And we can build form wizards or multi-step forms, which you must have encountered, whenever you want to install a software or install a game or something like that. You always encounter, form wizards or multi-step forms, and so on. So, and we can also, look into how we can work with API errors, integrate API errors and backend validation into our forms as well. So as you can see, there are so many aspects or avenues we can take, when it comes to building highly efficient forms and dynamic forms. And React, as usual, makes this process very much easier. So that's what we've been actually discussing in this series of meetups. How React actually helps us make our lives easier when it comes to web development. So based off that topic, we actually seen how React can actually augment the form building process and make our lives that much easier. So, now we've actually come to the end of today's session. So I actually hope I was able to impart even the tiniest bit of wisdom on building forms the React way. This is a great experience for me as well, a brand new experience for me. So thanks for joining in and taking part of this edition of the React Native Meetup. We didn't want to take too long, most of you guys are after work, and maybe you guys don't want to hang around for a very long time. So thank you for joining again. And please don't hesitate to post any questions you have by visiting the link pinned in the comment section. Our team will definitely get back to you as soon as possible. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.